Welcome to Reformed thinking. When you think about seminaries in the 19th century, what probably comes to mind is something pretty formal, right? Very academic. Well, one man, Charles Spurgeon, looked at the needs of his day and decided that just wasn't going to cut it. So today we're going to take a look inside his pastor's college, a place that wasn't built to make scholars, but to forge preachers for a practical world. And this quote right here, this really gets to the very heart of Spurgeon's whole philosophy. He felt the church of his time was just being choked by what he called officialism, a kind of rigid, dead formality. His idea was pretty simple. Real spiritual vitality, real life, was the only thing that led to actual success in ministry. And that idea became the bedrock for his entire college. So what made this college, which he started way back in 1856, so different? It wasn't just another seminary. Right from the get-go, it had a very specific and, for its time, a pretty unusual mission. Okay, this chart lays it all out. On one side, you've got traditional academia, which was all about producing scholars who were chasing classical honors. But Spurgeon's college, it was all about training preachers. He saw the push for literary prizes and that sort of academic ambition as a dangerous distraction from the real work. The whole focus was on developing a ready ability to speak and a consecrated spirit, all pointing toward one single goal. And there it is. That was the bottom line. Every class, every book, every single thing they did was measured against this one question. Does this help a man become wise to win souls? It wasn't about being smart for the sake of being smart. It was about getting the kind of wisdom you needed for real-world evangelism. And Spurgeon was not kidding about this. He said a student could be a master of Greek and Hebrew, but if he couldn't preach the gospel acceptably in a way that regular people could actually connect with, then the entire college had failed in its purpose for that man. Success wasn't about getting a degree. It was about seeing a soul won for Christ. All right, so who was this unconventional college actually for? Well, it wasn't for brand new converts or young guys who are just thinking about ministry. Nope, Spurgeon was looking for a very particular kind of person. See, the idea wasn't to make preachers out of nothing. It was to help men who were already preaching. You had to have a proven character, a real spiritual fire, and a natural gift for speaking. The college was for those guys who were already doing the work, but felt held back because, as he put it, their knowledge was a bit slender. And this is huge. If a man had the right stuff, the character, the call, the gifts, it didn't matter if he was poor. Spurgeon made sure the college was there for anyone God had called, not just the ones who could afford it. Okay, so with this focus on practicality and proven character, what were these guys actually taught? Well, it was a mix of two things: rock-solid doctrine and a really down-to-earth, practical way of teaching it. When it came to doctrine, there was no messing around. The college was all about the doctrines of grace, what we'd call Reformed theology, and the old orthodox faith. Spurgeon had zero time for what he called theological novelties. He basically saw them as old, bad ideas just dressed up in new clothes. So students were grounded in the historic Christian faith. But this strong doctrine wasn't meant to stay in a dusty old book. It was for the pulpit. Spurgeon knew he was living in a very practical age, so he trained his men to be natural when they spoke, to be smart about practical matters, and to get rid of all the weird mannerisms and pomposities you'd hear from other preachers. He wanted to tear down what he called the lath and plaster of old affectations and build on the granite walls of reality. And Spurgeon led by example. His own lectures weren't dry and boring. They were like a conversation. They were full of stories, and they were often pretty funny. He was showing his students how to talk about deep truths in a way that was real and engaging. So, you might be wondering, how in the world did they pay for all of this? The answer is just as unique as everything else about the college. It didn't have a big bank account. It ran on an engine powered by faith. Think about this. Every single week, the college needed 100 pounds just to keep the doors open. Back in the 19th century, that was a massive amount of money, especially when you remember that a lot of the students were not paying a thing. And how much of that went into Spurgeon's own pocket? Zero. Not a single penny. In fact, he was constantly pouring his own time and his own money into the college. That kind of personal sacrifice is what gave him the standing to ask other people to give. So, with no government funding and no big endowment, the whole thing was kept afloat entirely by the free will offerings of the Lord's people. It was literally a week-to-week operation, running on the simple belief that if this was God's work, God would provide for it.
So, what did a typical week look like? How did all this come together? Well, one of the tutors had this incredible metaphor to describe the whole process, and it just perfectly sums up Spurgeon's method.
A tutor named Mr. Rogers called Spurgeon's Friday session the sharpening of the pin. He saw the whole week of study as forging the basic metal pin, but it was Spurgeon's lecture that gave that pin its sharp, effective point, the thing that made it ready to be used. So from Monday to Thursday, the students were hitting the books hard, the sterner studies. By Friday, you can bet they were pretty worn out. That's when Spurgeon's lecture came in. It was designed to be lively and interesting, not just to cram in more information, but to fire their hearts and get them excited about putting all that learning into practice. And that really says it all, doesn't it? The whole point of the college wasn't just to polish up their minds so they could sound smart. It was to sharpen them into effective tools for the gospel, to give a real practical point to everything they learned. Spurgeon went after the old affectations of his day because he was certain that life is the true heir to success. So that leaves us with a pretty pointed question for ourselves, doesn't it? What are the modern-day conventions, the mannerisms, the lath and plaster in our churches and schools that might just be getting in the way of real, genuine connection and spiritual life? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us.